Member for Vancouver-Mount Pleasant.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise to enter into the debate Bill 2, Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act. And I just heard the Minister of Health and his comments, and I can't but help to make some comments about what he just said. Now, what I did hear him say was that, you know, he actually did acknowledge somewhere in that rant that the global greenhouse gas is a challenge. He actually did acknowledge that. I think it's particularly important that I wonder whether or not he'll actually share that information with one of his colleagues, who just yesterday, the member from Chilliwack Hope, said on the public record, and who actually says, while she would not call herself a denier, this is, of course, a global warming denier. She does not refer herself as to that. Then she goes on to actually talk about, my apology, he goes on to talk about that he suggests that the science is not yet settled. That's the comment actually on the public record. I find that particularly interesting because you actually don't have to look very far, Mr. Speaker, to actually know that global warming is impacting British Columbia right here, right now. Right now, we have a challenge, as the members know, about the pine beetle epidemic. This has gone on for some time, and part of the problem with the pine beetle epidemic is that of global warming. The reality is that the winters are not cold enough, and it's not killing off the bugs, and as a result of that is impacting our resource industry directly right here in British Columbia. So to pretend that this is not happening, I suppose some members could do that, can choose to actually be the ostrich and stick your head in the sand and pretend that I don't see the evil and I don't hear the evil and it doesn't actually exist. But sadly for us, it does exist. It impacts each and every one of us, not just today, but for generations to come. That's the reality, Mr. Speaker. And so the members and the government touts for months now, right, the highly anticipated legislations around LNG, right, on the taxation scheme, and right now we're debating Bill 2, the Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act. The Premier goes on the record, the Minister of Environment goes on the record, the Minister of Gas, Natural Gas goes on the record, right, to talk about, and they brag about how that British Columbia is going to deliver the lowest ever, the cleanest ever LNG facilities in British Columbia. So when you dissect those words, you figure out exactly what it means. When you look at this bill, it's 40 pages. It feels substantive when you hold it up. But when you look carefully, clause by clause, definition by definition, you figure out what the government is actually talking about, and you actually catch them out in their pattern of behavior, which is this continual pattern of saying one thing and then just simply turning around and doing whatever the heck they damn well want, Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker. So Bill 2 sets out the greenhouse gas GHG emission intensity benchmark for LNG facilities, and the Liberal government says that this act ensures that we have the lowest ever LNG facility in the world in terms of GHG emissions. Now, interestingly, here's the catch. When you talk about facility, literally in this act, it defines what a facility is. In this act, Mr. Speaker, under definitions, you don't even have to go very far, under definitions on page 4, facilities. Facilities defined all buildings, structures, stationary items, and equipment that A, are located or used primarily on a single site, contiguous sites, or adjacent sites, or 2, are controlled indirectly by the same person, and 3, function as a single integrated site. So the point I want to make out, and I'm not the only one who caught it, in fact, the public who's reviewing what the government's doing, they are examining what's going on, and there's an article that was posted in the website that I searched and found, and actually is from MacArthur Tetro, so it's not a disreputable organization that's come up with this, and there was an analysis done by Paul Cassidy and Selena Lee Anderson, and it was posted, and let me just quote. The 0.16 benchmark, which will cover all facility GHG emissions, including combustions, electricity generation, venting, and fugitives, from the point when gas enters the facility to where it is loaded onto a ship or rail car to go to market. Under Bill 2, a facility, quote, facility is defined as including all buildings, structures, stationary items, and equipment that are located or used primarily on a single site, contiguous sites, or adjacent sites. 2, are controlled by the same person, and 3, function as a single integrated site. This means that gas-fired generation owned by another party and supplied to an LNG plant would not fall within the definition of a facility, nor would the regime capture emissions from upstream activities. So, Mr. Speaker, it's one thing for the government to say that, gee, this is going to be the cleanest LNG industry ever in the history of human life, when in reality the limitations of what the government's put in is quite astounding. It's not just limiting it to facilities, it's a facility owned by the same person. So that is, in other words, as it's been identified by Paul Cassidy and Selena Lee Anderson, who correctly cites that if the facility or the components delivered towards the industry is done by another organization, owned by another organization, that actually does not count towards the emissions. So, I don't know, Mr. Speaker, that's only just one element of this, but it doesn't actually stop there. It doesn't actually stop there in terms of the weaselly ways in which one can get out in actually ensuring that the markers and the benchmarks are comprehensive and true to its intent when you say you want to deliver the cleanest LNG industry here in British Columbia. So let's measure what the government claims, what they like to say, versus what is reality. The government says, yes, the benchmark is 0.16 carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of LNG produced. Now, we have to actually understand that what the government's talking about is that it only counts, the emission only counts from the point when the gas enters into a facility where it is loaded onto a ship or a rail car to go to market. But what they don't tell you is that the GHG intensity benchmark does not apply to any upstream emissions. So, for example, Mr. Speaker, extraction, upstream combustion, flaring, fugitives, venting, pipelines, none of those things count. None of those things count in Bill 2 here. And according to the Pembina Institute, upstream emissions account for approximately, wait for this, 70% of the GHG emissions in the LNG life cycle. And that's not actually covered by legislation. Maybe the Minister of Technology will have something to say about that. When you don't count 70% of the life cycle of the LNG industry towards the emissions that is supposed to ensure that British Columbia has the cleanest ever LNG industry in the entire universe, how's that going? How do you not count 70% of the emissions towards this supposed claim of the cleanest LNG delivery here in British Columbia? I just find that astounding that the government actually can stand up with a straight face and say that. I do. I mean, are you kidding me? Now, let's just break down. Let's just break down for a minute, right? To see what exactly does this mean. Carbon pollution is released all along the LNG supply chain. We all know that. Every one of us know that. From the point where the shale gas is extracted to the point where it is burned for electricity or loaded for transportation. This is what people call, scientists call, people in the industry call, not just me, call as the GHG life cycle. Now, in the BC LNG context, life cycle GHGs include every point from the wellhead extraction to the waterline, the point where LNG leaves the province for export on the tanker. That is a true account of the process. And I don't think any member from the other side, from the government side, could dispute that. And the Pembina Institute provided a breakdown of the sources of the GHGs from LNG throughout the life cycle. It identifies that 30% of the GHGs come from LNG terminals and 70% from upstream sources, 9% from pipelines, 61% from extracting and processing shale gas. 61% of that GHGs from extracting and processing breaks down as follows. Upstream combustion and flaring, approximately 40%. Upstream methane, approximately 10%. Upstream formation carbon dioxide, just over 10%. So now, Mr. Speaker, based on Bill 2, the only portion that's covered by Bill 2's intensity benchmark is the 30% from the LNG terminals. That is the only person to which that it covers, the only percentage in which it covers, Mr. Speaker. So the further analysis by the Pembina Institute estimates, based on 24 million tons of LNG exported per year, which is just over half of BC's targeted volume, the life cycle emissions would be approximately 83.2 million tons. That's 16.5 million tons from extracting and processing natural gas to supply LNG plants. 1.3 million tons from transporting natural gas to LNG plants, 3.4 million tons from operating the LNG plants, and 62 million tons from burning BC's LNG. This 24 million ton figure is equivalent to the initial phases of Petronas and Shell LNG proposals. Mr. Speaker, the facts tell you something very different than what the government claims. The truth of the matter is, Bill 2 does not ensure that British Columbia will have the cleanest LNG industry ever in the entire universe. It simply is not true, Mr. Speaker. And without additional policy or regulations, a standard BC plant will produce life cycle greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to 0.96 ton of carbon of LNG produced. 1 ton fuel produced is roughly 1 ton of carbon pollution. This is actually 3 times higher than the leading facility in Norway and Austria, as it's been reported by Clean Energy Canada. I'm not making this stuff up. People who know what they are talking about research this material. We went to look into this matter when the bill was brought to the floor to find this information, Mr. Speaker. So for the government to claim, to tout, to suggest that somehow they're going to deliver with Bill 2 the cleanest LNG industry ever, is just simply not true, Mr. Speaker. But I guess in the liberal world, it is, because that's what they do. That is their pattern of behavior. Because time and again and again and again, not on just this issue, but on pretty well every other issue, they will say one thing and then turn right around and just do pretty well the opposite. They never actually deliver on what they say they will do. And here we are again on the biggest campaign promise that the Premier ran on in the last election. Here we are again. Failed yet another mark because basically her words is not even worth the paper that it is printed on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the future of British Columbia is too important. It's too important for the government to play these kinds of games. The natural resource, the fact is, belongs to each and every one of us. We are supposed to be the steward of our natural resource. We are so lucky to live in British Columbia and have such wealth that has been gifted to us. So we should value that. And how we utilize that resource, how we treasure that resource to generate economic activities, to ensure that those things that we value, that we enjoy today, are going to be passed on to future generations. British Columbians want the LNG industry to succeed. We want the LNG industry to succeed. But a successful LNG industry a successful LNG industry, Mr. Speaker, means honesty in its measurements. It means actually saying what you will do and doing what you will say, Mr. Speaker. And for us, on this side of the House, what we want to see are guarantees of jobs and training opportunities for British Columbians. What we want to see is a fair return for our resources, for all British Columbians to enjoy the benefit of our resources. What we want to see, Mr. Speaker, is benefits for the first people of this land, the very people to which they have shared their lands with us. And we want respect for the First Nations community. And what we, of course, want to see is protection of our air, our land, and our water, including living up to climate commitments, the very commitments that the Liberal government themselves touted and bragged about, to which now they have so conveniently just forgotten about what those commitments are. It does not mean say, Mr. Speaker, say one thing and then do another, as the current Premier is so prone to do. Mr. Speaker, Bill 2 provides LNG proponents with what the government calls, and I quote, flexibility. The pretend GHG intensity benchmark of 0.6 carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of LNG produced. What Bill 2 actually does is that it does not require actual GHG reductions. There is no cap on emissions. Right here on this bill, you look and look and look until your eyeballs are falling out and you cannot find it. Why? Because there is not a commitment from the government. Instead, they weasel in the words, what they call flexibility. I've heard those when the Premier was actually the Minister of Education. Good grief, I won't go into that, but let me tell you, flexibility meant a lot of things back in those days. And some things, I guess, just never change. And here we are again, flexibility. So that is to say, if proponents cannot reduce GHG emissions to 0.16 CO2 equivalent per ton of LNG produced, they can either A, invest in BC-based offsets at what they call at market prices, or 2, contribute to a technology fund at a rate of $25 per ton of CO2 equivalent. So in effect, Bill 2 does not actually require LNG proponents to reduce their GHG emissions. It sets a benchmark standard and then gives LNG operators a variety of options to get around that standard with offsets or technology fund contributions. In practice, Mr. Speaker, this means that the government can claim, right, that the BC LNG is the cleanest in the world, when in reality, it actually is not. That is the truth, Mr. Speaker. So again, it is just talk. It's just more talk and talk and talk. I guess maybe for the Premier and for the government, if you say it enough times to yourself, you actually believe it. That's what I know the government is hoping British Columbians will do, that they don't actually pay attention to the real things that are happening, on what really is going on. But if they hear it enough, they may actually believe that it's true, when in reality, it simply isn't. Bill 2 clearly states that companies are not required to actually reduce their carbon footprint. In other words, LNG facilities will not actually be clean. They will be able to purchase offsets, technology fund contributions to meet what I say, the Liberals' smoke and mirrors benchmark. Bill 2, facilities are permitted to emit as much as GHGs as they please, so long as they purchase the offsets. Now, when you think about this, Mr. Speaker, what does it mean in terms of the long-term sustainability of this industry for British Columbia? That means they don't ever have to work towards finding technology to reduce their GHG emissions. So as long as their profits can actually just pay and buy off the emission targets. As long as they can just erase that, they don't have to worry about it at all. And what does that do for our environment in the long term? What does it do for the children and the grandchildren in this house? We hear MLAs all the time get up to introduce their grandchildren. What does that mean for them in terms of the environment, for their grandchildren? That is a question that we should all ask of ourselves. Aren't we tasked here to look at that issue as well? Don't we actually look and debate these matters with that forward, long view in terms of how policies and decisions will impact future generations? Based on the acts of this government, and based on Bill 2, I got to tell you, I think not. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals, of course, want you to believe that they have incentives in place, according to Bill 2, that they are putting incentives to ensure that the industry come to play and that they will deliver the cleanest LNG industry ever in BC, when in fact it doesn't. But then, to top it off, aside from all of those loopholes, those weaselly clauses that let all of these things happen to not deliver clean LNG industry in BC, the government actually in Bill 2 makes available a large subsidy for the LNG companies when they perform between 0.23 and 0.16 GHG intensity. The government labels this as an incentive when it amounts to, frankly, to a subsidy. Now, to quote economist Mark Lee, this is what he had to say about this. And I quote, "The government will subsidize the GHG penalty as much as 100% of it for plants with emissions just over the standard, say, 0.17 tons, dropping on a sliding scale to 50% of the penalty for plants at 0.23. At that, no subsidy. Above that, there's no subsidy. What does this mean in terms of numbers? A 10 million ton LNG plant at 0.23 intensity would have to contribute $17.5 million to the tech fund, but half of that would be paid for by the government. And by comparison, the profits to the company for exports to Asia would be just shy of $2 billion. So the post-subsidy hit to the company would be less than half of 1% of total profits. At a 0.19 intensity, the subsidy ramps up and the hit to the profits would be about one-tenth of 1%. That's what it means That's why the government actually put in this clause to allow for the buyout if they were to exceed the benchmark, and a false benchmark at that. So even at this pretend benchmark, with all those loopholes embedded within it, there is still a buyout clause. Mr. Speaker, that's what Bill 2 says here in this document. Now, when you think about the offsets, I can't help but to go back and look at how the Liberal government's record's been on offsets. Let's just think for a minute. With the government's failed and much criticized and now scrapped Pacific Carbon Trust, the Liberal government was forced to scrap the Pacific Carbon Trust after a scathing report by the Provincial Auditor General, which found that the government's agencies were in fact buying offsets from the trust at a cost more than double the amount on the open market. Only BC Liberals would do that, actually. How's that for a deal? Then it found that the trust was purchasing carbon credits from projects that were in fact not eligible. How's that? How's that for practice for the government? Now, Mr. Speaker, I didn't make this up. This is actually what the Auditor General found to be the practice. And here we are with a major industry with a bill that the government gives exactly those offset opportunities. And there's no information in this bill whatsoever, really, to tell you how that would be implemented and to ensure that we don't actually have the kind of problems that the Liberals had with the Pacific Carbon Trust. Now, Clean Energy Canada pointed out that Bill 2 on its own basically won't result in the cleanest LNG in the world. So it's not just the opposition who's saying that. People who spend their lives on this issue, who are very concerned about it, who are knowledgeable about it, they're saying it. And the LNG production releases carbon pollution all the way down the chain of production from wellhead to waterline, and that this legislation, frankly, only addresses the last link in that chain, the port facility where companies would chill the gas to load it on board onto a ship. It allows the company to buy credits rather than actually build cleaner terminals. Imagine if Bill 2 actually had requirements for the industry to build those terminals that are in fact clean so that the government can make good on what they claim. Just imagine that for a moment. Unfathomable here in this legislature with the Liberal government at the helm. The quote continues to say, Clean Energy Canada continues to say, it'll take continued and strengthened leadership from both government and the industry before government can credibly tout the cleanest LNG in the world. Mr. Speaker, this is what we got to drive for. That's what will make the LNG industry a success. The government can actually make these changes, and we will have that opportunity as we embark into debate, into third reading. I'm sure that there will be amendments that will be tabled. I ask the members to rethink their strategy and their approach so that they can make good. I urge them to make good on their words of what they claim. When they do that, it will build confidence for British Columbians, for governments of any stripe, to deliver on what they claim. And maybe, just maybe, the participation rate for elections from the community won't be so low when we actually do just that. Mr. Speaker, there are many other pieces that I want to turn to, but I do see that the green light is now on, which is telling me that my time is running out. And I will just simply close with this. This bill, some 25% of the bill allows the government to change various regulations at a later date. No doubt, probably on a Friday late afternoon before a long weekend. So hoping that nobody would notice the already watered down provisions that are here in this bill. I mean, I've been here for a long time. I have not seen a bill with this much loopholes that will allow the government to put a lie to the claims that they make.
Thank you.